Okay. My screen went blank for some reason.
We can see you and we can hear you.
There we go. But there, now we're good to go. So good morning, everybody. It's Friday morning, February 25th. We're almost through the month, and so we'll call the meeting to order. And today we're discussing our S-258 and switching some other issues to that bill. And but the heading of it is to amend the required ag practices. That's the bill we're using. And so we have two guests with us, Laura DePietri and Jared Carpenter. And there was some questions that came up in regards to that, and Jared requested to testify. And Laura, I understand that you can only be with us for an hour or at the most, and sooner if you could get away. So I guess the question that we have is, have you folks requested or talked about or done anything to move forward with opening the required ag practices at the agency? And so if you could give us an overview in regards to that, it would be most helpful.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, and I think you know that all of us on the committee, so we won't bother to go around and introduce ourselves. So I think we're good to go.
Okay, well, I'm Laura DePietro, the Director of Water Quality at the Agency of Ag. So I do have a little more time if you need more time. So just I'm happy to participate as needed. So essentially, there's the question of the RAPs, which if we put out a draft, the Agency of Ag has a revision of the RAPs that we've sent out to folks last fall. It did not include, as you all are aware, the task for us was to include wetland revisions that to regulate in the RAPs what A&R doesn't regulate in wetlands, if that is something you recall. It did not have that aspect in it. That aspect is still being discussed among the various parties, but it did have the rest of the draft pieces to it. And essentially, you know, they're technical edits and just clarifications where we felt it wasn't really clear. So it wasn't intended to be an overhaul of the RAPs. Really, the intention is to deal with the wetland piece. But the other large piece that's in that is technical service providers. A couple of years ago, you all also gave us authority to regulate technical service providers who, they're people who write nutrient management plans for farms, essentially. And so we have, that's what we spent. We had a committee that worked for over a year with those folks and other interested parties and came up with a revision aspect to that. So that is really what the intention of revising the RAPs is with the wetlands piece. So the rest is mostly technical corrections.
And yeah, but you haven't put forth any requests to open the required ag practices, or do you have to do that?
No, we can revise them as we need to, right? But we haven't started the formal rulemaking process. We're still in that stakeholder process of just, we like to talk with people before we start the rulemaking process, so that way, obviously, we don't come up with information late in the game. So I'm guessing probably this summer is when that would start, when everything would be resolved as far as drafting between Agency of Ag, Agency of Natural Resources. And then we would go out and start the rulemaking process by formally starting an ICAR filing.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair.
Okay. Yes, Sandra?
So Laura, thank you. I think some of the confusion that I guess I'm picking up on is you started this informally, or you filed it and then withdrew it, or can you just, because it's,
No.
I guess I'm not getting that clarity, or it's just a discussion that's starting.
Yeah, so the agency of ag, admittedly, we do rulemaking a lot different, I think, than other folks. We spend a lot more time talking about the rule before we even start filing a rule. So that is the process. So we had, like I said, we had a committee that worked with TSPs. So we spent time working through that part. We drafted that. That piece was out as a draft a year and a half ago, maybe, with the community that was interested in it. So, you know, when we did the big overhaul of the RAPs, I mean, we spent a year doing, or a year and a half doing an ag work group with that. And then the legislature gave language. So we do a lot of upfront work, and then we get a draft that we feel we've taken a lot of input and we've gathered information. And then we file with ICAR. So we have not started the rulemaking process. We are in what we call the pre-rulemaking process, if that's a term that we can create for this purpose. So again, this summer, I would expect that we're probably going to be able to go forward with the rulemaking process and filing with ICAR. But all of it is just drafts at this point for discussion purposes.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah. Other questions from committee members? No. Well, we'll switch over to Jared then, and you'll be able to stay with us, Laura. Yeah,
Of course, I'm happy to.
because there may be questions, after we hear from Jared. So good morning, Jared. Good to see you on Zoom.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good to be seen. For the record, Jared Carpenter, Lake Champlain Committee. I feel that I've seen all of you a fair amount in catching up on your YouTube hearings and live. Actually, I've seen Senator Collmore a few times. I've been at the State House, so I've seen him up there, which has been nice to see folks. So looking forward to having you all back in the building in another 10 days-ish. It'll be nice to have everyone back, and then I can pester you properly in the hallways rather than having to do it just through email. So again, Jared Carpenter, Lake Champlain Committee. Little bit of background. Actually, yes, the environmental advocates saw a copy of the informal changes to the RAPs probably early November or sometime along those lines. And yes, mostly technical changes, technical service providers. There's some composting language, which I think has to do with the aftermath of the chicken bill, things of that nature. But there were some changes to the cover crop requirements and spreading on frequently flooded fields that raised some concerns. And we didn't really, reading through them a couple times, wasn't quite too sure if they were going to make things easier to spread or loosening the restrictions on cover cropping and just allowing 30% residue, things of that nature. So we started thinking in generation, the frequent precipitation events that, everybody has seen anecdotally over the past year or so, they've gotten more frequent, they've gotten more intense. So you look at the, you look at the radar, and it's not a gentle rainstorm. It's these red and orange blobs moving across certain areas that cause intense precipitation, maybe an inch or two in an hour. And our concern has been, for a while now, that the RAPs weren't adequate for handling that type of precipitation, that it was going to be too intense and too fast and wasn't going to have time to sort of percolate into the ground the way it normally would, depending on your soil type. Instead, the water was going to hit the ground and completely run off. And of course, if manure had been spread, take everything in the topsoil and everything with it down into the surface waters. And that's been a concern for a little while. And that was sort of exacerbated by these changes to the cover cropping and frequently spreading on frequently flooded fields. So the thought was, and S258 was that not to reopen, but in light of what AFM was proposing, was asking the agency to review the RAPs. Were the RAPs adequate to address climate change induced precipitation? That's the simple question. And, if you look at the bill, it doesn't ask for a reopener. It uses the words evaluate, review, and goes through about whether or not the water quality training is adequate, whether or not the buffer zones are adequate, whether or not the spreading from 100 feet from a potable water supply is adequate. Sort of going all the way through, digesting the process, having a public conversation with this, with the environmental advocates, with the farmers, with anybody who wanted to participate, discussing this, and then reporting back to you next year whether or not the agency thought that the RAPs were adequate or what areas might need to be changed. And then at the end of the bill, it says, if the agency so chooses, if the secretary so chooses, they would open formal rulemaking and amend the RAPs. So the bill doesn't open the RAPs. The agency had already proposing to open the RAPs. What the bill proposed was that people go and that an evaluation process occurs to see whether or not the RAPs are adequate to handle climate-induced precipitation. And that is the basis of our support for this, was just, okay, let's open it up and look at everything and whether or not it works. And if it doesn't, let's make changes where they're needed. And that was the premise behind the bill, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. So it's basically a review of the process and come back with recommendations next season, whether or not to open the RAPs.
Well, actually, there's two parts. It's a report back to you about whether or not they're adequate, but then it leaves it to the discretion of the agency whether or not to open rulemaking. Of course, this body could put in statute that they want, or make a formal recommendation that the agency open it. But the bill leaves that up to, my reading of the bill is it leaves it up to the agency of whether or not the rulemaking would occur to make those necessary, if needed, changes to the RAPs. But between now and then, it will evaluate whether or not everything is preventing these sudden heavy rainstorms that we know have been happening that wash topsoil and everything else off the field. Do they work?
Yeah.
And that was the basis for the review, sir.
Yeah. And Laura, have you looked over the content of 258 to see if that would work, how it would work for the agency?
Yeah, so give you a couple pieces of background here. So when we revised the RAPs in 2016, that was a big overhaul, right? And EPA was very much involved with that. And it was nice because they did a ton of modeling. And one of the things, as everyone is aware, that the first TMDL for Lake Champlain that was rescinded was because of climate change not being fully integrated into the TMDL. And so that was one of the tasks that EPA had to do. And so, of course, the state agencies, we had to provide information to EPA to be able to have them assess that. So EPA looked at and modeled what we proposed for the RAPs. And again, since then, we've even edited them more, right? Like the tile drain, for example, that 2018 revision was not part of the conversation for the 2016 effort, but EPA did an assessment and determined that the RAPs will meet climate change goals. And then EPA further said that they had actually way overestimated the climate. So at this point, to us, that tells us that for the assessment that has been done, that the RAPs are more than sufficient to address the climate change. And the reason is because the way that we wrote the RAPs, it's about performance-based, right? So if the fields are saturated and likely to generate runoff, that's the performance standard. Don't apply manure, and if it runs off, you're going to be held liable, right? And so we didn't say something to the effect of the intensity of the rainstorm. It was just like, no, the conditions of the field will generate runoff, and if we see the runoff, then you're liable for it. And so it's a performance-based standard, and I think it's better than saying by a specific date, for instance, put in X practice. It is don't do this bad management if it's going to occur. So I think overall the agency, we've looked at our RAPs, we built them and spent a lot of time working on this with EPA, and feel that I mean, what more would you tell a farm other than you cannot have runoff of these wastes? You can't have erosion that exceeds the standard. You can't have gullies in the field. You again can't have these conditions if it's frozen or snow covered, unless you have an exemption, which of course, we had a couple of bad years. There's no doubt there where we had a lot of snow and a lot of challenges, but those came with enforcement actions, right? So the process of all of this is that the agency is very concerned in trying to do our best in this space. And I think we've got it covered. So we feel that the RAPs as they're drafted, of course, we'll listen to testimony and make adjustments as needed, but that further edits to this based on the letter that was received by the agencies from the environmental organizations, that we've done that work.
Yeah, are there questions, Chris?
Yeah, Laura, could you talk a little bit about the thinking of the proposals around cover cropping and what that looks at? Because I hear what you're saying about the standards based out, and looking at the outcomes, but there are practices that are likely to influence the outcome. So help me understand what your thinking is there, please.
Absolutely. So in 2016, the adoption of cover cropping was still taking off, right? At this point, it's pretty rampant. We have really good adoption of cover cropping across the state with the farm community. And so the original thinking back then was we set up spaces where we would require cover cropping. So specifically in frequently flooded soils and by certain dates. And one of the things we learned with the frequently flooded soils, there isn't really good mapping, right? We picked the best mapping we thought we could work with, given all the tools that we know that exist out there. And when push came to shove and we started trying to implement this rule, it wasn't doable. The maps were so inaccurate, and the reality of the capacity on the ground and the effort to try and give people the right information, because farmers wanted to comply, right? They wanted to say, tell me where I have to do this, tell me where I don't have to do this. And it was too much, frankly, because the maps are so inaccurate to be able to do that on every farm. We have a lot of river floodplain land in the state of Vermont, and a lot of it is agricultural land because it is flatter land. And so it was just untenable to do that. So we do have, we're taking out the maps because we learned they're not a good enforcement tool. They're going to spend more time administratively when the reality is farmers are already doing the cover cropping. And then we're taking out the dates, because the dates specifically, we literally were having to answer phone calls on beautiful days where farmers are like, are you serious? I need to get my cover crop in today when it's pouring, and next week it's gorgeous. And so those realities of date management don't make sense. And we understand that, but what we were trying to do was at the time that we created it, push people forward so that way they would meet the dates of the federal programs, they would meet the dates of being able to get good cover crops in. But sadly, at some level, the irony is that if climate change continues, the growing season may get longer on the back end, and there's more time to do that as well to get the good cover crop establishment. So, there's some years where we've had it where starting in October, it rains the entire month, and then it just snowed all of November and December. Nobody was able to get much going on before then, and then, we're using enforcement discretion because the reality is you can't work with that, right? You can't plant cover crop into snow. And so by having these dates, it didn't give any benefit to anyone. Everyone was trying to do the practice, right?
So you're saying we wouldn't anticipate fewer cover crops under the
I don't think you will, because part of the other backdrop of this is A, farmers have adopted cover crops, I think is a good practice, right? But also B, if they don't have them, they may need them for their erosion standard. So in order to meet erosion standards, you have to have rotations, you have to have cover crops most typically, right? So that's I think a lot of what drove a significant amount of cover crop. But I think the adoption then has brought it to other fields that maybe they could have done different practices. So overall, I'm not seeing a trend towards less cover crop. We're seeing demand in our program exceed, which, the FAP program in that list, the dominant practice that we fund is cover cropping by far in that list. And every year we exceed, there's more requests than we can ever pay in that program. So people are doing it on their own.
I was wondering about that. How much do you pay? So do you have more requests for cover cropping than you have money for? I
Every
think
year,
you-
absolutely. Yep, since the
So-
inception of the program.
So why aren't you asking for more money? I mean, we've had truckloads for the last couple of years of money. So why hasn't the agency come in and asked for more revenue to push that cover cropping to the limit? Or is there a
Well, so
problem? Is there a problem with getting the equipment to seed with?
no, there's not any challenge there. We have received significant funding through the Lake Champlain Basin program. So Senator Leahy was able to secure funding to go through that method, which goes from Lake Champlain through DEC to us, to be able to use in that program. And so we received over $1 million, I want to say, in the last couple of years through that program to further help support it. But certainly we work with what we have. The demand is even greater. I mean, the reality of paying for, 100,000 acres of cover cropping every year is a significant amount of draw on any budget. And there's just no way we'll ever be at that level. Farmers are adopting it and doing it on their own. They can also go to the federal government and request funding there. We spend a lot of time coordinating with USDA to make sure that there's no double dipping, right? So no one's getting payment from the USDA and from us. So we strategize how best to put the resources in, and essentially it's a first come, first served basis. So farmers that are able to get their application materials in, complete their granting process, and go through the motions are able to get in and get the resources paid for. But we also have caps on the program too, right? So we limit it such that we want more farmers to be involved rather than few, right? So if only a few farmers came and used up all of the money that was available, it would certainly they would adopt it, but it wouldn't allow others to try it and adopt it. So that was how we set up the program years ago, was to have a cap so that multiple farmers could get access to it. And, our findings are people are doing it on their own, and they're okay with that, it seems like at this point, with some cost share for some acres and not for others.
And how many acres, you mentioned, how many acres are being cover cropped at the present?
I will have to get that number for you. I don't have it off the top of my head.
And
we wouldn't know the total answer, right? Because we don't know what the farmers are doing on their own. We only know what the government programs are paying. And we know that they're doing significantly more than that.
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm watching Mr. O'Grady, who's with us, and I don't know if it's a fair question, but Michael knows more about this than I do, and I'm wondering if there are questions he might suggest that I would be smart to ask as counsel. I'm just curious because, Michael, I'm being a little cheeky, but you do know this stuff and you've been through the history, and I'm curious if there are thoughts from where the committee's coming from that we should think while we have a couple of guests here.
The one question I would put to Laura would be, are the changes to the Farm Agronomic Practices Program in S258 going to allow you to push more money to cover cropping instead of other practices that you might have felt you had to retain some money for when you got the Farm Agronomic Practices funding?
No, the idea is just for flexibility with that. So that's just to remind everyone, that's the list I think you're asking, is we propose to cut the list and just open it up that we could choose practices. We, of course, would keep cover cropping, but like an example is the pre-side dress nitrate test. I want to say when that program was first created, which is probably 12 or 13 years ago, we maybe paid for 5 tests, right? Like we don't pay for those tests. Farmers will do them with their consultants, and it's not something that is demanded of the program to be able to do, to where people need the support for broad acres of cover cropping as an example. So it allows us, and over time people have developed, like we've added a practice where we pay for grazing. If someone can maintain 3 inches of cover grass all year long so that they're doing good grazing, we pay them per acre for the grazing. And so these kinds of additions to the program, we just wanted to be able to be clear, like we're not always, I believe back in time that list used to say shall, and we changed it to a may. And now it's just, let's have flexibility to adapt to what farmers need in each year based on what we think is the most important practices to be able to fund.
My next question is, that there's a ton of money coming in for water quality through the federal IIJA, ARPA, et cetera. And most of that money's going to ANR or being pushed out through ANR through the SRF funds. Are you getting any of that money? And if you're not, maybe the committee wants to think about recommending that some of the water quality funding be shifted around because ANR is getting a lot more money.
So under the climate aspect, because these practices are good for climate, there is in the governor's budget a proposal to add to FAP through that. We have seen through other states, we're still working on getting the permissions and making sure that we've got the oversight of it, because those funds are really meant to be used for capital construction type projects, right? And cover cropping fits in a different category, which is why it's always been in the general fund, right? But in other states, they use the state revolving loan fund. The SRF funding is the eligibility threshold, like the same definitions for SRF or what they're using for ARPA. And in other states, they have used it for things like cover cropping and agronomic practices. So we are working to try and get there, but of course, there's a lot of approvals that we need to make sure that we want to, dot our I's and cross our T's, not to misuse these funds, but to use them for truly eligible things. And if that was able to be determined, then we would, and the budget were approved as proposed, then we would have additional funding in that space.
Okay. Those are my two big questions.
Jared?
Yes, just in terms of the funding, Mr. Chairman, there is in the FY22 budget, if you remember, there was $10 million added each year, 30 million total to 22, 23, and 24 that go to the Clean Water Fund to be distributed by the Clean Water Board. And I believe for FY23, off the top of my head, that there's $3 million has been requested by the governor to go into the AAFM water quality grants. How that, as Laura indicated, how that is sort of broken up on the ground and what the ARPA can be used for versus what the state revenue can be used for, what the capital money can be used for, all which sort of gets poured into this pot is sort of the question. And I think there's certainly, there was $11.9 million to that fund in FY22 and 10.6 requested for FY23. So there's money there. There has been some, and anecdotally talking to folks of whether or not, we hear talking to people, it's like, well, you want to tighten the wraps, but there's not enough money to go around. It's like, okay, so who's getting the $11.9 million? Is it going to, big machines, or is it going to the little guy who needs just $5,000 or just something to do a couple of projects or just to keep put the fence up to keep the cows out of the river or things of that nature. So if more money is needed, I think we'd be willing to advocate for more money, but we've always sort of wondered, where's the money going now? Who's the beneficiary? So that's certainly a question for discussion, sir.
Yeah. So, Lord, well, I'll go to Corey first.
It doesn't chime in now, but I thought part of the reason we had Laura in today too is to talk about the bedding issue between digesters and whether it's sold and considered an input or brought from one farm to another farm that the same family may own and then becomes a waste product, to get clarity there.
Could I ask that we evolve to that when we kind of close, because that is an important discussion for our bill. But
yeah, that we could get to that as long as we have some time for Laura has some time to stay with us, but it's a different subject matter, and we should try to get this one ironed out first. So Laura, do you have any kind of a record of where your money's going that you're already receiving?
Yeah, so Jared, you've public record requested a number of our inspection reports over the years, and I think you'll be able to see in reflection, looking at those inspection reports, that's where that money's going, right? So as we inspect these farms and we identify challenges, these farms sign up for programs, and that's, the ARPA money, the approvals we've had so far to date are for infrastructure and for equipment. And so the bulk of it's going to go to infrastructure in production area practices through like, our BMP program. I think all of you are familiar with that. So it'll fix areas where there's risk of pollution from a production area. So that's the bulk of it. And those practices are expensive. And in this last COVID round, everything went up cost-wise. So the beautiful thing is that as we've done this whole work and this evolution, in my opinion, yes, I am biased because we are doing the work, but agriculture has done the right trajectory, right? We educated, we worked with farmers, we changed the regulations, and then we increased our staffing capacity. As you all know, we didn't have the resources. And the product of all of that is now we have significant demand on the programs to have farmers coming in and stepping up and trying to do all these practices. So we've ramped up our engineering staff to address that, and the money is also being ramped up. You'll see in the proposed budgets, we are asking for significantly more money because we have 8 engineers now that can go out and design these practices and get these projects done on farms. So we have the demand. We built the program, and the farmers, it was interesting during COVID, we actually didn't have the money right away, and we actually asked for an emergency allocation because we had to tell farmers we didn't have the resources at that point, and we worked with the Clean Water Board to get an allocation to increase that. So even with increased prices, the demand was still up and farmers are still willing to do this stuff. So that's where the bulk of the money goes, is into that BMP program. The capital equipment assistance program, we usually do about $1 million a year in that program, and that helps with the practices, make sure you can inject manure versus just apply it on the ground kind of thing. So a lot of the practices, Jared, that you all had suggested in your request, those are the types of practices, drills to make sure that cover crop seed can get better germination. And so every year, for the last number of years, we've been investing at least $1 million into that program to be able to get equipment on the ground. And then the new request would be, yes, in the climate aspect, there's another $5 million of ARPA if we can get all the right permissions to do the agronomic piece as well. So we're trying to put all the pieces together.
So the money, getting it on the ground, the money being used for cattle lanes and manure pits and issues like that? Because I've seen up north here, I've seen many new manure storage systems, like slurry systems put in that cost, got to be up toward $1 million. And I wondered about that in a couple of cases up here, why we were spending so much money on a small farm, putting in an above ground slurry type system. But if we take and put $800 to $1 million into one farm operation, I mean, that would do cover cropping and soil management on maybe 10 farms. Are there caps on those expenditures?
Yeah, it's untypical that, one manure storage would cost that much money. I would say, probably around 100,000, but I'm not, it used to be about 60 to 80,000. So I'm guessing maybe gave it 150,000. It is typical. That doesn't mean there are atypical situations. And slurry stores are usually put in when the soils are not conducive to having it in the ground. So it needs to be up above the ground with a base underneath it, because those slurry stores have a concrete base underneath them. And then they're glass lined typically. But anyways, but the whole farm, if it's, if you're dealing with the manure storage, it might trickle into, like you said, a laneway where animals might walk back and forth from a barn to a parlor. It may also deal with the silage leachate, the collection of that, the addition of that into the manure storage, because then you're collecting a lot more rainwater. And so the storage has to get bigger. And so all of that, when you pull one thread on the farm, what happens is you end up with a bigger contract with them to do a lot more practices. And so that's where you'll hear like this $1 million project. The $1 million project might be much grander than just the manure storage that you're seeing going up. And just as a reminder, we do have another program. So where it doesn't make sense environmentally to make those kinds of investments, we can look at the Ag Environmental Management Program, which we've done a couple of these projects where we say, you know what, this money was better not spent that way. And instead trying to rebuild somewhere else, or, in one instance, we did pay the gentleman. he was, willing to say, I'm no longer going to farm here. And we paid him for that loss of those animals, and supported him to go elsewhere, and supported him through easements and other things to create what will soon be a lovely walking park, I believe, down in the lower Intervale. So there are other ways that we look at this, but the reality is there are caps. That was one of your questions. There are caps on the BMP program. The federal government has caps, the state government has caps. But the reality of the concentration of potential pollution from some of these areas, they need to be addressed, right? We can't just ignore them and work on the cover cropping aspect side specifically. We have to do both. And, again, these costs get high and farms need support. And, that's one of the charges in the statute is that, these costs will be borne by the citizens of Vermont for these infrastructure improvements. Where the cover cropping, those costs can be, a lot of the time, maintenance, energy can be done by the farm with some support from government. So, certainly they both take resources, but making an investment in capital infrastructure improvement usually requires a loan from a farm, to where making decisions to do cover cropping, some farms can do that without a loan.
So, well, anyways, Chris, did you have a question?
Well, when we're ready to wrap it up, just a comment. So go for it.
Well, I don't want to discharge the language that's in 258 if we can use some of it or change it to everybody's liking, that would be the best solution, but we don't want to go crazy with it either. Jared?
No, that was going to be sort of, well, I suppose closing remarks, although we're not quite closing it, it doesn't sound, but, cover cropping aside, I think there are other aspects of the RAPs in 258 that should be evaluated. I mean, we're going to get these more frequent, intense weather events. I think they're going to become more and more common, and it would be good to get ahead of the problem rather than playing catch up on the problem later, in that maybe the buffer zones aren't wider, maybe the education's not adequate, maybe there's other aspects of the RAPs that should be evaluated, potentially moving forward in a discussion as to whether or not they really will be effective in the changes. I submitted, if folks want light reading over the weekend, I submitted the 2021 Vermont climate assessment that Gund put out in, I believe, this past November. It comes in at a nice 519 pages of assessment of the impacts on climate, on the state, of precipitation, on agriculture, that this is going to become more and more of a problem. So in order to get ahead of it, the thought would be that you have this dialogue of whether certain parts of the RAPs, cover cropping aside, should be evaluated and tweaked. So, Mr. Chairman, do you look at, are the entire RAPs looked at, or just certain sections evaluated? Or, I mean, I think that's worthy of discussion in its own right over a period of time, and then, reported back to you for further discussion, and if they need to be changed in the future, so be it. I understand the new RAPs, the amendments right now, they're going back and forth with DEC about some of the wetland stuff, and everything's been hung up for a little while, is my understanding. So this go around of the opening of the RAPs and amending it might not be available unless the agency is willing to wait until an evaluation of the RAPs would be completed, and that it can all happen together. But thank you very much for the discussion. I mean, I think it's something that's really worth considering.
Well, I mean, we're all very concerned about making sure that we, the farmers, aren't polluting unnecessarily, that and the money's going to the right places to help the most.
Yes, sir.
So, Laura, what about the review? Are you folks constantly reviewing, or would this help you if we had something in regards to a review in this bill? Would it help you along to do a more thorough review and report back?
Well, so I could go through each one of these things in the bill and explain to you, what we've been doing, because we are constantly under review. But I wonder, because, Jared, to the credit of all of you that proposed the original letter that sort of mirrors this bill, there were no actual hard recommendations, right? So like understanding specifically what you all think is missing would be helpful, because this just says, evaluate to see if farms that are under the threshold should be regulated, as an example. We visit and inspect all these farms, and we built the RAPs that if you're under that threshold and you have a water quality issue, we can bring you in. So when we build the RAPs, we build all these like stopgaps, right? To say like, this is the main focus, this is what we're going to do. But should there be something outside of that, we can bring it in, which is our, in section 11 of the RAPs is that even if you're complying with the RAPs and it's not working, we can require more, right? So, and then the buffers, we have the ability to expand the buffers, right? So like we built all of these wraparounds where the focus is clear so that the farms know what they're supposed to be doing. And then if there's a random situation, because legitimately no farm is ever the same, we're able to take that situation and try and address it to make sure that the water quality is protected. And so, I think we've done a very good job of this. And if there are specific things, and if it's helpful as we go through this RAP process to sit down with the environmental organizations on that letter to talk about what you feel like we should be assessing, we're happy to do that. That's absolutely part of the process. But more specifics would be helpful, I think, in our space of what your specific concerns are.
So what you're saying is that you'd be glad to sit down with the Lake Champlain group and try to get this worked out without a bill. I mean, you don't need a bill to tell you to do this if you're willing to do it anyhow, right?
Yeah, no, we're happy to sit down and meet. And we haven't sat down. I think we sat down with maybe 5 or 6 farmers when they were having their own meeting. But otherwise, we haven't done outreach yet. We just shared the draft. So in our normal process, what we will do is we will go out and meet with the various groups. And so the environmental organizations, that's normally what we do. We would sit down and meet with you. So if there are more specifics, I think that would be really helpful. There's a lot of pieces to have conversations about the reality, right? So like requiring cover crop everywhere as an example, the reality is there's going to be years you can't do it. And so what do you do with a regulation that you can't enforce? And sometimes you have to let it go and sometimes you can't, right? So like trying to navigate some of those spaces, it's very easy to sit and talk about something as a regulation. It's much different to sit in my shoes and actually try and decide how are you going to enforce this? And when are you going to say, well, we get it. You couldn't do it there. There was no physical possibility that you could have done it there. And so how do you manage that? So I just encourage you as you're thinking about the solutions to think about sitting in my shoes and trying to figure out how you would actually enforce that.
Well, I'm sure that it gets very dicey at times. That's for sure. And of course, with the more climate changes that we're getting, it seems like getting every year, it even adds to it. So Jared, is that a possibility that you guys could, I mean, you've got quite a group there of people that signed on to the letter. Could you get that kind of narrowed into a tighter group of items and work with Laura on this without doing the bill? And I don't know who's going to be back next year, but I think probably some of us will be back. And if things don't fall together right, we can do a bill requiring certain things. So yeah, I think this is giving everybody a pretty fair warning
Yes,
or
sir.
the way to go.
Yes, sir. More than willing to have conversations with the agency about specific concerns about widths of buffer zones and, and things of that nature. It's, I think it was about 3 to 5 years ago, we were told that the tile drain research and BMPs on tile drains would be done in about 3 to 5 years. So I think that conversation might be overdue as well. I know the agency has been doing a lot of research, or had folks doing a lot of research on that and how that could potentially impact, heavy flows on those waters that don't just sort of percolate into the ground, but instead really, can cause a gusher, so to speak. And I know that they've been looking into that for a while. So curious to see what that has resulted in. So sure, we can talk over the coming months, and if and then informally come back and talk to the committee next year or offline, sir.
Yeah, I think, that would be most helpful. And then we would have two years to get things worked out and move through instead of 2 months. So that might work well. Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Jared and Laura. I appreciate you making time. I guess I want to talk a little bit about motivation. Senator Polina and I think we're pretty clear when we filed this bill that this was to have a discussion, and this morning has been I think an interesting and valuable discussion. But beyond that, well, I'll speak for myself. I think the motivation, I look at these issues as not a right or wrong. I look at our landscape as badly needing farms, our community and our culture and our economy, dependent on farms, and that farmers are working in an economy that is frankly abusive. It is, completely unfair, and it's been that way for decades. And that, so when they see a bill like this and hear from maybe others like me, I can appreciate that is not a warm and fuzzy feeling that they get. At the same time, we do have water quality issues. We have an obligation to fix water quality. We have a changing environment. Just think about this winter of the yo-yo temperatures. I mean, it is undeniable that factors around our climate and weather are changing. So I wanted to have this conversation. I am heartened to hear that Laura and folks at the agency are willing to, and I would expect, frankly, in regular communication with interests, not only in the agricultural sector, but in water quality, environmental. We can't sort of all agree that farms are central to all aspects of our state and then only talk to farmers. We have to, and I believe that more often than not that is happening. But so I think this is an important conversation. This was kind of my goal to see if we could make sure we were understanding the different parts and moving pieces here. And so I appreciate the time, Mr. Chair, and for our guests, thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I think, I think we're moving in a good direction with this discussion, and I appreciate both Laura and Jared being here and talking this out and making sure that they'll get together in the off session and come back with whatever that they can somewhat agree on. And I think the other important part is to make sure we utilize this bunch of money that has been delivered to us, gets used in the best ways and does the most good to help our ag community and clean up our waters. Because I've always said a farm without good water and good land isn't worth a cent. So there isn't a farmer out there that wants to spoil either. But we've got to make sure to try to get the means there to, with the way their economy has been, it's been rough. And so I guess, thanks, Chris, for pushing me, I guess, to get this discussion going. And so I think if there's any more on that, we'll move to Corey's question on, and you're welcome to stay too, Jared, if you
Yeah,
can.
I'll stay in the background, so to speak, in case I'm needed, although I don't think I will be. But Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the time. Greatly appreciated. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the committee. And Senator Pearson, thank you on this issue as well. And looking forward to seeing you all in 10 or so days, and have a good break. Take some time off.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
So Corey, would you want to move on your subject with how a product changes from bedding to waste because it's being taken
Right.
to another farm?
Yeah, so Laura, one of the concerns we're hearing from a couple farms up here is if they have a digester and they take the solid out, after the water's been taken out, after the whole digesting process, and use it for bedding on their farm, it's not a big deal. Then if they sell it, it's considered an agriculture input. But if they take it from one farm and move it to another farm that they have, they're saying the agency is considering that a waste and it's causing issues with their permits. Talking to Michael, seeing if we could draft language that potentially would clarify that. He already believes that there's there's no need to change language there. Basically, it's just how it's being enforced. So could you take us through how what's going on there from your perspective and why?
Sure. And are we specifically referencing the ag waste definition that's in the housekeeping language? Because what that language does, if you recall, is that says the current definition says it's something that is emanating or originating on a farm, and the edit is to say also imported onto a farm. And the reality is that the material you're talking about is manure that then is usually digested, so it's heated up for pathogen kill, and then it's dry. The liquids and the solids are separated, and the reality is that the solids then are therefore, they're dried out and they're heated, so therefore they can be reused as bedding. So essentially, if you think about a sawdust in the barn mixed with manure, basically gets re-separated back out, and so you've got this sawdust, but it does have manure on it, right? Because it was commingled with the manure. And so essentially that byproduct in all of our definitions, regardless of this change, right? Because this change is just about imports. It is a waste, but that doesn't mean that, it's a waste when it becomes a problem, if that makes sense. So, right, like if you have manure and you have it run off into water, that's obviously a waste that would require challenges. And so like if you had a pile of this bedding material, you need to stack it in certain places. We have regulations, and that's why these regulations apply to say, like, you can't go put it next to water, right? Because it is defined as a waste. But if you manage it well, then it won't ever be something that's, a problem as far as a waste. So the definition doesn't necessarily change that. Whether it is made on one farm and transferred to another farm, it is still required to be managed by the RAPs to be, stacked, stored, not have runoff, et cetera, no matter where it is on either farm, if that makes sense.
Not really. If you sell that to a farmer down the road, they come and get it in their big truck and they can take it to their farm and it's bedding. If the same owner moves that product in their big truck to their next farm down the road and uses it for bedding, then it's not bedding. They're putting waste under their animals. And I don't understand how usually that product, it's anyone that I've ever visited keeps that product in a closed in, at least roof over, three sidewalls. And so it's stored in a building that's built to store it in. So when do you get it back to being a waste because it goes to your other farm rather than to the neighbor's farm?
Would you like me to answer that, or I see Mike O'Grady's hand is up?
Well, Michael could explain it, and then I'll ask you to explain your thoughts behind it. Michael?
So regardless if we're talking about bedding or fertilizer or just straight manure that's imported from one farm or transferred from one farm to another, it needs to be managed properly, right? So when it's brought onto the farm, there are requirements for setbacks or stacking or distance, isolation distance from wells. That all needs to be complied with. So I think that's Laura's point, is that you can bring it between farms, but it has to be managed properly on the farm where it's received. And my question for Laura, because this keeps coming up in relation to 258, is section 4 of 258, the non-sewage import language. And there's a question of whether or not the bedding is going to need a permit or approval from the agency. And I don't read that language as requiring approval for this bedding, because it's not going into the manure pit and it's not going into the methane digester. And I just wanted to confirm that with you.
You are confirmed.
Right. So they can move it between farms. They just need to manage it properly, and they're not going to need approval from the agency underneath section 4 of S258.
Correct. But it will, on the back end, be calculated as part of their manure generation. So that's how it gets incorporated into the nutrient management plan.
Right. Got it. And that's fair.
So,
Yeah, the edit to the definition of waste and ag waste is meant for things that are not generated from a farm, right? So this is obviously generated from a farm. It is for the other materials that might be brought into a farm that are not originating from a farm. They may be originating from a factory, for instance. So the ability to make sure that anything that comes into a farm, if we feel like it is a waste that falls under this regulation, that the secretary could make that determination, and therefore then it becomes a waste and would have to comply with all the other requirements in the RAP, such as setbacks of stacking and things like that. But the non-sewage waste program, the only authority that program appears to have based on our read of it is something that is directly put into a manure pit or a digester.
So if you bring that that bedding from one farm to another, you have to keep track of the tons that you bring, and then that's added to your second farm where you're bringing it to as a waste for the manure pit. Would that be accurate? The
So it's
size
no different than if you...
the size of the manure pit. If
So
you bring 200 tons of this bedding to the second farm, that 200 tons has to be accounted for in regards to the size of the manure pit. So if your pit is at a certain size, you might not be allowed to bring it there because it's going to eventually end up in the pit.
So as part of developing a nutrient management plan, farms have to do what we call a manure generation calculation. And part of that is how much stormwater runoff from the site is being collected, right? If there's runoff from the bunks, for instance, how much bedding do you use? What type of bedding do you use? So even if it were sawdust or it was bedding recovery materials, which are what we're talking about here, the reused bedding, either one of those will be an input into that calculation to figure out the total mass of manure at the end. right? So everything that gets put into the manure pit is calculated. And then that has to be land applied. And so you have to make sure that you have the land base and, you know, the ability to manage within the nutrient management requirements for that land base to be able to land apply that. And if not, you would need to export essentially.
So if you are using bedding anyways, I don't know how you measure that at the ag agency. Is it if it's measured in cubic feet or in yards or how you measure it? But if you were using sawdust and you bring in a trailer load of sawdust a week and you stop bringing that in and brought a trailer load of this reusable bedding, what's the difference? Do you analyze the
There's no
whole
difference.
permit?
The calculation is the same for how you would generate, is my understanding.
So I don't see where that would even be an issue, because you had to be using bedding prior to using this new bedding. So you're swapping out one for the other. And if they're calculated the same, why would there even be a question in regards to the permit on the second farm where you move the product to?
Yeah, this proposed change in definition doesn't change how reused bedding is managed on a farm, right? It still needs to be managed for water quality, whether it's on farm A, B, C, or D. It's always been the same and it will continue to be the same. That once you have it, you have to, you know, meet the setbacks. You're absolutely right, Senator Starr. People, you want to keep it dry, because if you get it wet again, the bacteria can come back into it. So they store it typically very appropriately because it's important for the animal health and the business. So it's not been our biggest challenge by any stretch, right? People don't usually mismanage bedding recovery materials because of that storage purpose.
So have you had any complaints or violations or any issues with that issue?
I think what I've seen come through enforcement is where people might load out of one of those storage units, that any of the debris that might get on the concrete around it, if there's a ditch nearby. So that's where loading and unloading out of a structure might be a challenge. And we might tell someone, you know, you need to make sure that that doesn't get out of that space and do better housekeeping to keep it in the storage and not out on the concrete.
Well, I should
But
think
otherwise,
they would,
no.
I would think they would want to do that anyways, because if you get it wet, it isn't any good. But so Corey, do you think are you happy with your answers?
Not entirely. I still think there's some confusing things, but I think it's some for us to monitor and see how it plays out.
Yeah, and do you need a letter or anything to
I
support?
think a letter clarifying it from agriculture would be nice, so that way, you know, we've got it on the record here, it's recorded, but it would be nice how it would be viewed and enforced.
Is that something you or somebody in your division could send over to Corey or the committee?
I'm happy to talk with Steve Collier and give him the message that that's the request. And what I'm understanding the request to be is, you know, is recovered bedding considered a waste? And I think that that has always been considered a waste, and that this change in definition doesn't change that it's a waste. But if that's the request, I can ask him that request. But also,
Yeah.
Senator Parent, if
I
there
think
is
the
a
letter would be
particular-
helpful, and if we have questions about the letter, you know, we can pick this up, and maybe, you know, we'll have other bills if we have to address it.
Yeah.
And I'm happy if you have a constituent that it's worth connecting me with, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, I think at this point, just a general letter would be helpful, and then I can communicate with them.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
talk to Steve Collier.
Any other questions for Laura? If not, 10:08, Laura, so we didn't do too bad.
Thanks, Laura.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks a
absolutely.
lot. And I think, it's important that you work with Jared or whoever to try to get that, this other question cleared up and because I'd rather not do bills if we don't have to. It'd be a lot nicer just have the groups work together as close as possible and try to get the issues addressed that way. We're lucky we're
Absolutely.
not
And
we're lucky we're not in Washington. We'd be pulling each other's hair out and stuff. So we'll do it the Vermont way. We'll try to do it the Vermont way if we can.
yeah, Jared, we'll definitely be in touch. With climate, there's, it's been a whirlwind with climate over the last year. That committee worked so intensely, but obviously all the solutions, a lot of the solutions in agriculture go to that agronomic piece and, soil carbon sequestration. So I think we're coming up for air from that now that the cap is written and everyone's starting to move towards, how do we roll this out? There's definitely a space where we all need to coordinate there. And then obviously the RAPs and our shop is going to do a lot of that implementation that relates to the climate. So there's a whole body of work there that it would be really good to spend more time together and coordinate. So thank you.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Looking forward
Well,
to it. Thank you so much.
thank both of you. And
Thank you,
so,
Mr. Chairman.
committee will move back to our bill at hand. Thank you again, Laura.
Hi.
So Michael, where are we with our 258 bill? Chris, are you all set on moving forward?
Yeah, and I really appreciate the time, everybody. I know it wasn't, well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I think it was time well spent. And hopefully, it'll get things started in the right direction. So anyways, morning, Michael.
Morning.
Thanks for being here and being with us. So you want to run through 258 as it is?
Sure. So you made a couple of changes. I'll share the screen and then put up what's on your committee's website.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. Hold on a second. All right. Hold on. I thought I messed up for a little bit. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So you asked for two changes. The first is in section 7, and it is in that farm agronomic practices section that you were talking to Laura about somewhat. And it was reinstating some of the list. This isn't the latest copy. Hold on a second.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I think I forgot to send Linda the latest copy. Why don't I tell you what I did, and then I'll send Linda the copy as well. So on page 9, line 17 through 21, the strikeout is removed. The strikeout on lines 15 and 16 are also removed. The strikeout on 7, 8, and 9 remains, but there's now a new category 7, which provides that there can be funding for additional soil-based practices that improve soil quality and nutrient retention, increase crop production, minimize erosion potential, and reduce agricultural waste discharges. So you kept the first 6 and then you revise what the agency was looking for in 10. And that is the change there. And then the next change is in section 9. The only change that you made here is on page 11, line 12. At the very end of that line, you wanted exists to change to exist. And I will send Linda the redraft right now. I'm sorry. I looked this morning and I just thought what was up there was what I had intended, but it was not. Sorry, and that's my fault.
Are there any questions about what we changed or what we added? This section 9 is just moving the date out for the task force to continue. The other changes, any questions from anybody?
No, we did talk about the good standing issue, but I guess we're just gonna leave it the way it came over from the agency.
Well, I think that if we had more time, we might be able to work that a little different. So I just don't, usually what happens when that issue comes up is difference of opinion and personalities and that, and how the heck do you regulate something, an issue like that? Because the inspector and the owner of the business or farmer don't agree on something. Yeah, there should be, and maybe there is a process where you can go before a committee and get those differences resolved. But I still think, unless it's really, really bad on the part of the state employee, the commissioner or agency head's going to agree with their help. You usually try to stick up for your people if you possibly can. So, it's next to impossible to write a law to tell somebody not to get stupid when they're, working with the public. But so I think I ought to pass on that and think about it
Okay.
a little more.
I assume this will have to go to approps because of the extension of the per diems.
Yeah, and that's why I'd like to get the bill moved because we've only gonna have that. Well, we actually are gonna have 2 weeks because they don't have to get their bills out until the second week after we come back. But it's gonna be a mad scramble, and with the way we're doing in session and out of session and all that, I'd like to get this moved down the hallway to so it'll be on the desk in approach.
Okay. What's the
Chris?
draft number gonna be, Michael? 3.1?
Yes.
Okay. I saw Chris Pearson had his hand up.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, do you mean to vote on this like right now or this today? I gather, but I'm wondering if it's right now.
Yeah, because we don't have anything that's hanging, and I know everybody's busy doing other things, and if we get done this, I just want to review a little bit about what we're going to do when we come back, and then we'll adjourn.
Okay, I would, I'm happy to vote this morning. I wonder we could take just a little break and I confess to just wouldn't mind a moment to read the latest draft, and also thought maybe I could try to see if Senator Polina
Yeah.
could join us for a vote.
That's
Well,
fair. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to get Anthony in a position where he could vote.
Yeah.
So Michael, is that corrected draft something you can get to us?
I've sent it to Linda, but Linda just emailed me and said that she doesn't have it. So I've sent it.
So maybe we could take a 10 or 15-minute break and then come back.
Yeah, why don't, 10:30 or
Sure.
25 of 11?
Yep.
So-
I do need to go to another committee at 10:30.
Oh. Well,
No,
I think
Sorry,
we're
Michael.
good with the draft. It's just getting it to us.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you can make sure Linda has that, that would be excellent, Michael.
Okay. I will try to confirm.
And if we don't see you, hopefully you'll have a little time next week to yourself and if you can take it and enjoy it.
Thank you. Thank you. You too. I hope you
Yeah.
guys have a good week off.
So
Thanks,
Linda,
Michael.
All right.
we'll come back in 15 minutes. So it'll be 25 of or something like that.
Okay.
I'll reach out to Senator Polina. And Linda, can we assume you're about to post this?
Yes, as soon as I get it.
Okay, dynamite. Thank you.